Hello everyone, I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Nestled deep in the woods, far from the bustling highways and noisy cities, stood Raven's Inn, a place forgotten by time. Its wooden walls were weathered and cracked, the faded sign above its door swaying gently in the cold midnight breeze. Few travelers ever came this way, and even fewer stayed the night. For Sarah and her friends, the inn was supposed to be a quiet stopover on their road trip. They had planned to get some rest before continuing their journey, unaware of the inn's dark reputation. The storm had forced them to seek shelter, and this lonely building seemed like their only option. As they stepped into the dimly lit lobby, the air grew colder, and the heavy scent of damp wood and mildew filled their lungs. The innkeeper, an older man with tired eyes, greeted them with a quiet nod. "Rooms are upstairs," he said simply, handing over a single key. His voice was hoarse, and his gaze lingered on Sarah a moment too long. The group climbed the creaking staircase, their footsteps echoing through the silent building. Their room was small but warm, with 2 beds and a window that overlooked the shadowy forest. They joked about the inn's eerie vibe, chalking it up to the storm and their tired minds. But as the clock struck midnight, the first knock came, soft but deliberate, echoing from the door. Sarah froze, her heart racing. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Her friends exchanged uneasy glances, their laughter fading into silence. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a faint whisper that sent chills racing down their spines. "Let us in." The second knock sent a chill through the room, silencing the nervous laughter that had filled the air just moments before. Sarah's eyes darted toward the door, her breath catching in her throat. The storm outside howled against the windows, but the knock had been deliberate, too deliberate to be the wind or a creaking floorboard. "Who could it be at this hour?" asked Mike, the most skeptical of the group. He glanced toward the door, his brows furrowed in confusion. The others exchanged uneasy glances, the tension in the room growing thicker with each passing second. Sarah approached the door cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No response. The silence on the other side of the door was deafening, broken only by the faint whistle of the wind outside. She reached for the doorknob, hesitating as her instinct screamed at her to stop. "Maybe it's the innkeeper," whispered Julie, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. "He didn't seem all that normal to me." Sarah shook her head. If it were him, wouldn't he have just said something? She leaned closer to the door, her ear pressed against the cold wood. For a moment there was nothing, just the sound of her own breathing. And then, faint and almost imperceptible, came the whisper, "Please, let us in." Sarah stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth as a wave of dread washed over her. "There's someone out there," she said, her voice shaking. But they don't sound right." Keller shook his head. "Still, I don't know." The group huddled together, their eyes fixed on the door. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the wind howling like a chorus of voices. The small room felt suffocating now, the air heavy with the scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of faint scratching against the door. Mike stood abruptly, his jaw clenched. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice tinged with irritation. "It's probably some prank. I'll check it out." "Don't," Sarah pleaded, grabbing his arm. "Something's not right about this." "Eviev?" Mike shrugged her off and strode toward the door, his movements stiff with frustration. He yanked it open, revealing the empty hallway beyond. The dim light from the flickering bulb cast long shadows on the cracked wallpaper. But there was no one there. No footsteps, no sign of movement, just silence. "See?" Mike said, turning back to the group with a smirk. "It's nothing." But before he could close the door, the lights in the hallway flickered violently, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When the light returned, Sarah gasped, her eyes widening in terror. A shadowy figure stood at the far end of the hallway, its shape barely discernible but undeniably human. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. "Close the door," Julie whispered, her voice trembling. "Close it now." Mike hesitated for a moment before slamming the door shut, his hands shaking as he locked it. "What was that?" he muttered, his bravado gone. The room fell silent again, but the oppressive air lingered, heavy with unspoken fear. The scratching at the door resumed, softer this time, like nails dragging across the wood. Sarah clutched Julie's hand tightly, her knuckles white. The whispers returned, louder now, threading through the storm outside like an unwelcome melody. "You can't keep us out." The group backed away from the door, their breathing shallow as they tried to make sense of what was happening. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and writhe, growing taller and darker with each flicker of the light bulb. Julie whimpered, her voice barely audible. "What do they want?" No one answered. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a chaotic chorus that filled the room. Sarah's eyes darted toward the window, her heart sinking as she noticed the faint outline of another figure standing just outside the glass. Its face was obscured by the rain, but its hollow eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. "Don't let them in," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "No matter what, don't let them in." The whispers seemed to swirl around the room, their haunting tones growing louder and more insistent with every passing second. Sarah's hands shook as she pressed her back against the far wall, her eyes darting between the door and the window. The figure outside hadn't moved, its faintly glowing eyes fixed on the room like a predator stalking its prey. Mike's bravado had evaporated, replaced by a tense silence as he stared at the locked door. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "There's no one out there, so how are we hearing them?" Julie whimpered, clutching her knees to her chest. "I told you we shouldn't have stopped here," she whispered. "This place isn't normal." The storm outside seemed to intensify, the wind howling like a chorus of voices. The figure at the window disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but streaks of rain cascading down the glass. Sarah exhaled shakily, but her relief was short-lived. A faint scratching sound echoed through the room, this time coming from the floor. Sarah's heart raced as she looked down, her breath catching in her throat. The floorboards near the center of the room were shifting, the edges rising and falling as though something beneath them was trying to break free. "What's happening?" Julie cried, her voice rising in panic. "What's under there?" Mike grabbed a chair and slammed it against the floor, hoping to force the movement to stop. The chair splintered on impact, but the floorboards continued to shift, the scratching growing louder. Sarah stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached for the rug covering the center of the room. The cellar felt colder, emptier, as though the life had been drained from it. Sarah's thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The box, the whispers, the glowing symbols. What did it all mean? Why had the figures wanted it so badly, and why had they let them go after taking it? She knelt where the box had been, running her fingers over the dusty floorboards. The faint outline of the symbols was still there, burned into the wood like a scar. Her fingertips tingled as they brushed over the marks, a faint echo of the energy the box had radiated. "What is this place?" she asked aloud, her voice breaking the tense silence. "Why did they let us go?" Mike stopped pacing and looked at her, his brow furrowed. "Maybe it was never about us," he said slowly. "Maybe it was always about the box." Julie raised her head, her tear-streaked face pale and drawn. "But why? What was in it?" Sarah's stomach churned as she thought back to the whispers, the warnings, the desperate pleas. She remembered the figure's hollow eyes and the way they had stared at the box as though it were a lifeline. "It wasn't just a box," she said quietly. "It was a prison." Mike frowned. "A prison for what?" Before Sarah could answer, a faint sound reached their ears, a low, rhythmic tapping echoing from somewhere above them. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, filling the cellar with an eerie cadence that sent chills racing down their spines. Julie whimpered, clutching Sarah's arm. "They're back," she whispered. "They're not done with us." Sarah shook her head, her jaw tightening. "No," she said firmly. "It's not them." The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by the faint sound of footsteps descending the stairs. Sarah's heart raced as she turned toward the trapdoor, her body tensing for whatever was coming. But the footsteps weren't heavy or deliberate. They were hesitant, almost reluctant. A figure appeared at the top of the stairs, its silhouette illuminated by the faint light filtering in from the room above. It wasn't one of the shadowy beings. It was human. The figure stepped into the cellar, revealing an older man with a weathered face and tired eyes. Sarah recognized him immediately. It was the innkeeper. What are you doing down here?" Mike demanded, his voice sharp with fear and anger. The innkeeper didn't respond at first. His gaze swept over the group before settling on the burned symbols on the floor. His shoulders sagged, and he let out a long, weary sigh. "You shouldn't have touched it," he said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "You should have left it alone." "What have I done to—" Julie's voice cracked. "What was it? What was in the box?" The innkeeper hesitated, his eyes distant as though recalling something from long ago. Mike's jaw clenched. "And now it's gone. So what happens to us?" The innkeeper's gaze darkened. "The seal is broken. What was inside is free now, but it's not bound to you. Not yet." Sarah swallowed hard. "What does that mean? What happens next?" The innkeeper turned toward her, his expression grim. "It means you've been marked," he said. "You touched the box, you carried it. It's a part of you now, whether you like it or not." The whispers returned, faint and distant, threading through the silence like a haunting melody. "We're not done yet." The innkeeper's words hung heavy in the air, their meaning sinking into Sarah's chest like a cold dagger. Her hands trembled as she stared at the faint symbols burned into the floorboards, their glow now faded but still pulsing faintly in her mind. Julie shook her head, her voice cracking. "We're marked? What does that even mean? Can we fix this?" The innkeeper sighed, the lines on his face deepening. "There's no fixing it," he said. "You carried the box. You drew its attention. Wherever you go, it will find you. Now you must silence it back and turn it to something else." Mike slammed his fist against the wall, the sound reverberating through the small space. "So that's it?" he growled. "We're just supposed to live with this? Run until it finally gets us?" The innkeeper didn't answer, his tired eyes fixed on Sarah. "You were the one who opened it," he said softly. "You might be the only one who can end this." Sarah thought for a moment and then blurted, Sarah felt the weight of his gaze, her stomach churning as the room seemed to close in around her. The whispers had grown faint, but they were still there, threading through the silence like a sinister lullaby. "How?" she asked. her voice barely above a whisper. "How do I stop it?" The innkeeper shook his head. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever was locked away in that box, it's free now, and it's coming." What? The trapdoor above slammed shut, plunging the cellar into darkness. Sarah's heart raced as the whispers surged back, louder and more chaotic than ever. The shadows in the corners of the room began to writhe, curling toward them like tendrils of smoke. "We have to get out of here," Julie cried, her voice trembling. "We can't stay." Sarah clutched her chest, the faint burn of the symbols etched into her memory. Her mind raced as the innkeeper's words echoed in her ears. "It will find you." She flicked through the photographs one by one, seeing them for the first time. The ground beneath them trembled, the floorboards groaning as the walls seemed to shift and buckle. The shadows surged forward, their tendrils twisting around Sarah's ankles. She let out a choked cry, her fingers clawing at the walls as the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. "You belong to us." A blinding light erupted from the symbols on the floor, the burned markings glowing with renewed intensity. The shadows recoiled, their forms disintegrating as the light filled the room. The whispers faded into silence, leaving behind an eerie stillness that made Sarah's ring. When the light subsided, the cellar was empty. The shadows were gone, the whispers silenced. But Sarah knew better than to feel relief. She looked at Julie and Mike, their pale faces reflecting her own fear. The innkeeper stood at the bottom of the stairs, his expression grim. "This isn't over," he said softly. "The box may be gone, but its curse remains." As Sarah climbed the stairs, the weight of his words settled over her like a heavy cloak. The night was calm now, the storm passed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. And as she stepped out into the cold night air, a faint whisper threaded through the wind, sending chills racing down her spine. "We're always watching. The curse of Raven's Inn follows its chosen, binding them in a web of fear and shadows. Escape is an illusion, and the whispers never truly fade." "Don't," Julie pleaded, grabbing Sarah's arm. "We don't need to know. We don't have a choice," Sarah whispered, her voice hollow. "Whatever's happening, it's already here." With a sharp tug, Sarah pulled the rug back, revealing a trap door embedded in the floor. Its edges were worn and splintered, the wood darkened with age. Strange symbols had been carved into the surface, their jagged lines glowing faintly in the dim light. "What is this?" Mike asked, his voice shaking. Sarah knelt beside the trapdoor, her fingers tracing the symbols. They felt cold under her touch, sending a chill through her body. "I don't know," she murmured, "but I think it's connected to whatever's out there." The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. They seemed to be coming from the trapdoor now, faint and fragmented, as though echoing from a great distance. We're waiting. Julie backed into the corner of the room, her eyes wide with terror. "Don't open it," she begged. "Please, don't open it." But Sarah's curiosity burned brighter than her fear. She gripped the rusted latch and pulled. The trapdoor creaked open slowly, revealing a dark, narrow passage that descended into the earth. A damp, metallic smell wafted up, making Sarah gag as she leaned closer. At the bottom of the passage was a small wooden box, its surface covered in the same glowing symbols as the trapdoor. The whispers grew sharper, more frantic, their words forming a single, chilling command. "Take it?" "Absolutely not," Mike snapped, grabbing Sarah's arm. "We're not messing with whatever that is." "Okay," Grandpa chuckled, "taking a box." But Sarah shook him off, her hands reaching for the box despite the icy dread curling in her stomach. The moment her fingers brushed the wood, a jolt of cold shot through her, and the whispers stopped abruptly. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting as Sarah lifted the box into the dim light. Its surface was etched with strange, intricate carvings that seemed to shift under her gaze. The lid was sealed tightly, but it radiated a cold energy that made her hands ache. The last and longest of the stone boxes. "What have you done?" Julie whispered, her voice barely audible. Tears streamed down her face as she backed farther into the corner. "You shouldn't have touched it." Before Sarah could respond, the door to the room rattled violently, the pounding force shaking the walls. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their words cutting through the air like blades. "You've taken it. Now let us in." The light bulb flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Sarah clutched the box tightly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The door groaned as the pounding intensified, and for the first time, she realized they wouldn't stop until she opened it. The darkness in the room was suffocating, pressing down on Sarah and her friends like a tangible force. The pounding on the door grew louder, each impact rattling the walls and sending vibrations through the floorboards. The whispers had intensified, their chaotic voices blending into a single, bone-chilling plea. "Let us in." Sarah clutched the box tightly to her chest, her heart pounding as cold dread settled over her. "What do they want?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Mike paced near the door, his hands running through his hair in frustration. "They want that thing," he snapped, pointing to the box. "Whatever it is, it's what's keeping them out." "But why?" Julie cried, her voice cracking. She pressed herself into the corner, her knees drawn to her chest as tears streamed down her face. "What did we do to deserve this?" The room seemed to groan in response, the walls creaking as though the building itself was alive. The air grew colder, the metallic tang of blood filling their lungs with every breath. Shadows in the corners stretched and writhed, their forms shifting unnaturally as they crept closer to the group. The pounding stopped suddenly, replaced by a deafening silence that made Sarah's ears ring. She turned toward the door, her grip on the box tightening as a faint scratching sound began to echo through the room. It was soft at first, like nails dragging against wood, but it grew louder and more insistent, sending chills racing down her spine. "They're not going to stop," Mike said, his voice low. "We have to do something." Sarah shook her head, her hands trembling. "What can we do? We don't even know what this is," she said, glancing down at the box. Its glowing symbols pulsed faintly, as though responding to her fear. "If we give it to them, what happens to us?" Mike opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the window shattered. Glass rained down onto the floor as the storm outside surged into the room, carrying with it an icy wind that made Sarah's teeth chatter. The shadows gathered near the broken window, twisting and curling into the faint outline of a figure. The figure's hollow eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, locking onto Sarah with an intensity that made her stomach churn. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, filling the room with a sense of impending doom. Julie let out a choked sob, burying her face in her hands. "We're not getting out of here," she whispered. "They won't let us leave." Sarah glanced toward the trap door, her mind racing. The passage below might lead somewhere, anywhere but here. "The cellar," she said suddenly, her voice sharp. "We can hide there." Mike hesitated, his eyes darting toward the trap door. "And then what? We wait for them to break down the door? That's your plan?" "Yes." "Do you have a better idea?" Sarah shot back, her voice rising. The shadows near the window began to move, their tendrils stretching toward the group like hungry fingers. "Because if you do, now's the time to share it." "I've tried everything," Sarah replied, turning to pull away. Without waiting for a response, Sarah grabbed Julie's arm and pulled her toward the trapdoor. Mike followed reluctantly, his jaw clenched as he cast one last glance at the door. The scratching had turned into a deep, guttural growl, the sound reverberating through the room. The group descended into the dark passage, their footsteps echoing off the narrow walls. The box in Sarah's hands grew colder with each step, its glow casting faint, flickering light that barely illuminated their path. The metallic scent was stronger here, mingling with the damp, earthy smell of the cellar. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a small, claustrophobic space lined with rusted shelves. The floor was uneven, covered in a thin layer of dust that swirled around their feet. Sarah set the box down carefully on the floor, her hands trembling as she stepped back. "What now?" Julie whispered, her voice barely audible. Before Sarah could respond, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "You can't hide." The trapdoor above slammed shut, plunging the cellar into complete darkness. Sarah's breath hitched as the box began to hum softly, its glow intensifying. The ground beneath them trembled, and a faint creaking sound echoed through the space. The whispers grew louder, forming a single, chilling sentence. "You belong to us now." The cellar's oppressive darkness pressed down on Sarah and her friends, the only light coming from the faint, flickering glow of the box on the floor. The whispers echoed through the small space, their haunting words overlapping into a chaotic symphony that made it hard to think. "You can't run, you can't hide, let us in." The ground beneath them trembled slightly, a low groan reverberating through the walls. Sarah's chest tightened as she stared at the box, its symbols glowing brighter, pulsing as though it were alive. The air grew colder, the metallic scent mingling with a new, acrid smell, like burning wood. "What's happening?" Julie whispered, her voice trembling. She clung to Sarah, her wide eyes darting around the dark space. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, her own fear barely contained. "But whatever it is, it's getting stronger." Mike paced in the small space, his movements frantic. "This is insane," he muttered. "We should have just left it upstairs. Why are we even still holding on to it?" Before Sarah could respond, the trapdoor above them rattled violently, the sound echoing through the cellar. The whispers grew louder, their chaotic tone now infused with anger. "You took it, you keep it, you are ours," Varen said, addressing Jack. The door above groaned as though something heavy was pressing against it. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and the vibrations in the floor intensified. Sarah stumbled, grabbing onto a rusted shelf for balance. The box on the floor began to hum louder, its glow illuminating the small cellar like a pulsating heartbeat. The shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, curling and twisting as though alive. Sarah's breath hitched as she saw a figure emerging from the darkness, a tall, gaunt silhouette with hollow, glowing eyes. It didn't move, but its presence filled the room with an unbearable tension. Blackness poured from the darkness. Julie let out a strangled cry, backing into the wall. "It's here," she whimpered. "It's already here. It's already making its way to me. I cannot see it," he muttered. Mike grabbed a piece of broken wood from one of the shelves, holding it like a weapon. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice trembling. But the figure didn't react. It simply stood there, its hollow eyes fixed on the box. The whispers sharpened, their chaotic words merging into a single command. "Give it back." Sarah's hands shook as she stepped toward the box. "What happens if we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Will you let us go?" The figure tilted its head slightly, its glowing eyes narrowing. The whispers grew softer, almost pleading. "You took what was never yours. Return it, or stay forever." Mike shook his head, his grip tightening on the broken wood. "We can't trust it," he said. "What if they're lying? What if giving it back just makes things worse?" "Worse than this?" Sarah shot back, her voice rising. The shadows in the corners of the room were growing thicker, stretching toward them like tendrils. The temperature dropped further, their breaths visible in the icy air. The trapdoor above slammed open suddenly, the sound echoing like a gunshot. A cold wind swept through the cellar, carrying with it the faint sound of footsteps descending the stairs. Sarah's heart raced as she turned toward the staircase, her eyes widening as another figure appeared. Identical to the first, but smaller, its hollow eyes just as piercing. "They're coming," Julie whimpered, tears streaming down her face. "We have to do something." The box began to hum louder, its glow intensifying until the entire room was bathed in its eerie light. The whispers returned, more urgent now. Gableland said, "Give it back or join us." Sarah hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't trust them. How could she? But every instinct screamed that holding onto the box was worse. She reached for it, her fingers brushing against the cold surface. The figures moved closer, their hollow eyes glowing brighter. The shadows surged forward, curling around Sarah's legs and pulling her toward the box. She let out a strangled cry, her hands gripping the box tightly as the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. "Take it," she screamed, shoving the box toward the nearest figure. "Just take it and leave us alone." The moment the figure touched the box, the whispers stopped. The shadows retreated, and the glowing symbols on the box faded into darkness. The figures froze for a moment before turning and retreating into the shadows, taking the box with them. The cellar fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting as the temperature slowly returned to normal. But the relief was short-lived. Sarah's breath caught as the whispers returned, faint and distant, threading through the stillness like a warning. "It's time to quit being afraid like marriage in bed with worries," Sarah reflected warmly. "It's never over." The silence in the cellar was deafening, broken only by the sound of Sarah's ragged breaths. Her legs trembled as she leaned against the damp wall, her mind racing to process what had just happened. The box was gone, taken by the shadowy figures, but the eerie weight of their presence still lingered. Julie slid to the floor, her face buried in her hands. "It's over," she whispered, her voice shaking. "They took it. They're gone." Mike wasn't so sure. He paced the small space, his eyes darting to the trap door that now hung open, its edges splintered and warped. "For now," he muttered. "But what if they come back? What if—" His voice trailed off as he glanced at Sarah, who was staring at the spot where the box had been. The cabin sat at the edge of a dense forest, its wooden frame weathered by years of storms and neglect. The air around it felt heavy, carrying a sense of foreboding that made the hairs on your neck stand on end. For Maria, it was supposed to be a simple weekend retreat, a chance to escape the chaos of the city and find some peace. But from the moment she arrived, something felt off. The front door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty cabin. The scent of damp wood and stale air greeted her, mixed with something faintly metallic she couldn't quite place. She brushed off her unease, convincing herself it was just an old house settling into the quiet of the woods. The living room was sparsely furnished, with a worn sofa and a small fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A single window overlooked the dense forest, the trees swaying gently in the cool evening breeze. Maria set her bag down and let out a deep breath. "Just a few days," she whispered to herself. "I can handle this." But as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched long and dark across the floor, Maria noticed something strange. The front door, which she had locked earlier, was slightly ajar. Her chest tightened as she approached it. The lock was intact, the deadbolt still in place. Yet the door refused to close fully, as though something unseen was wedged between it and the frame. What if— And then she heard it, A faint sound from the other side of the door, like a whisper carried on the wind. "Let me in." Maria stared at the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The faint whisper from the other side was barely audible now, blending into the soft rustle of the wind outside. She stepped closer, her bare feet creaking against the old wooden floor. The door swayed slightly, the hinges groaning as though resisting her touch. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal of the doorknob. "Hello?" she called softly, her voice quivering. There was no response, only the faint creak of the cabin's walls settling in the evening chill. The lock was still in place, the deadbolt engaged, yet the door remained slightly ajar, refusing to close no matter how hard she pushed. Maria pressed her shoulder against it, using her weight, but it barely moved. It was as though the house itself was holding it open, defying her attempts to seal it. The forest outside was dark, the trees swaying gently in the wind. The moonlight barely penetrated the canopy, casting fragmented shadows across the overgrown path leading to the cabin. Maria's gaze flickered toward the edge of the tree line. For a moment, she thought she saw something move, a shadow darker than the rest, shifting unnaturally between the trees. She stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. "It's just the wind," she muttered to herself, though the words felt hollow. She turned and closed the door as much as it would allow, sliding a chair in front of it as an improvised barricade. The cabin was silent except for the occasional creak of the wooden beams and the faint whistle of wind seeping through the cracks in the walls. Maria moved to the small kitchen, her nerves fraying as she filled a glass with water. The cool liquid offered little relief to the knot tightening in her stomach. Her eyes darted toward the window above the sink. It overlooked the same shadowy forest as the door. She froze, her breath fogging the glass as she leaned closer. There was something, or someone, standing just beyond the edge of the trees. The figure didn't move, its silhouette tall and still, blending with the shadows of the night. Maria blinked, and it was gone. Her hands shook as she placed the glass on the counter, the clink of it against the surface louder than she intended. "Get it together," she whispered, trying to steady her nerves. "You're just tired, that's all." The words offered little comfort. She returned to the living room, the air around her feeling colder now, heavier. The chair she had placed in front of the door had shifted slightly, as though it had been pushed from the other side. Maria's chest tightened as she stared at it, her mind racing. The faint whisper returned, threading through the silence like a chilling breeze. "I'm already here." She spun around, her eyes scanning the room. It was empty, just the same worn furniture, the fireplace, and the faintly glowing embers of a fire she hadn't lit. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper now, shifting slightly as the flickering light danced against the walls. Maria grabbed her phone from the coffee table, her fingers fumbling as she tried to turn it on. The screen remained blank, unresponsive, despite her repeated attempts to restart it. Panic set in as the realization hit her she was completely cut off. A soft creak broke the silence, pulling her attention to the small hallway leading to the bedrooms. The door to the master bedroom was slightly open, its dark interior barely visible from where she stood. Her breath quickened as she took a cautious step forward, her ears straining for any sound. The creak came again, this time from inside the bedroom. Maria hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn and run. But something compelled her forward, a mix of fear and morbid curiosity driving her steps. She reached the doorway, her hand trembling as she pushed it open. The room was empty, its sparse furniture bathed in the pale light of the moon filtering through the curtains. The bed was neatly made, the sheets undisturbed. But the closet door was open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. "Ouch!" The faint whisper returned, this time from behind her. "You can't lock me out." Maria froze in the doorway, her breath catching in her throat. The whisper echoed faintly in her ears, soft yet chilling. Slowly, she turned to look behind her, her heart hammering so loudly she could barely hear the creak of the floor beneath her. The hallway was empty, but the air felt different, heavier, charged with an unseen presence. Her gaze darted toward the front door. The chair she had placed as a barricade was now completely toppled over, lying on its side like it had been pushed with force. The door was still ajar, the faint glow of moonlight spilling in through the crack. Maria's chest tightened as she realized the whisper wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was inside. She stepped cautiously back into the hallway, her feet moving slowly, deliberately. Her eyes flicked toward the living room, then to the kitchen. Everything appeared as it was before, yet the feeling of being watched was undeniable. The shadows in the corners seemed darker now, stretching toward her like they had a will of their own. As she backed into the living room, her heel caught on something soft and she stumbled. Her hands shot out to steady herself, her fingers brushing against the cool fabric of the sofa. She glanced down to see what she had tripped on and gasped. It was her bag, the one she had left by the front door when she arrived. It was now sitting in the middle of the living room, its contents spilled haphazardly across the floor. Maria knelt down, her hands trembling as she picked up her phone, wallet, and keys. They were cold to the touch, as though they'd been left outside in the frost. "What is going on?" she whispered to herself, her voice shaking. She gathered her things quickly, her eyes darting around the room. That's when she saw it. Something that hadn't been there before. On the coffee table was a small, worn notebook, its leather cover cracked with age. She hadn't brought it with her, she was sure of that. The book seemed out of place, its dark surface glinting faintly in the flickering light of the fireplace. Slowly she reached for it, her fingers hesitant as they brushed against the rough leather. The moment she touched the notebook, a cold jolt shot through her hand, and she yanked it back with a gasp. The book's cover shifted slightly, its edges curling as though reacting to her touch. The faint scent of burnt wood filled the air, and for a brief moment she thought she heard the whisper again, clearer this time. "Read it." The handwriting was jagged and uneven, scrawled in dark ink that seemed to bleed into the paper. The words were cryptic, their meaning unclear. And then, "The door is the key. It lets them in, but it also keeps them out. You must choose." Her stomach churned as she flipped to the next page. This one had a crude drawing of a door, its frame surrounded by strange, swirling symbols. At the base of the door was a faint outline of a figure, tall, thin, and featureless, its presence unnerving even in the crude sketch. A sudden knock at the door shattered her concentration, and she dropped the notebook with a startled cry. The sound was loud and forceful, echoing through the cabin like a gunshot. She backed away from the coffee table, her eyes fixed on the door as the knocking continued, relentless and unyielding. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the steady pounding of the door. The notebook lay open on the floor, its pages flipping wildly as though caught in a strong wind. The whispers returned, louder now, threading through the pounding like a sinister chant. "It's already inside. It's waiting for you." Maria's chest tightened as she glanced around the room. The shadows seemed to shift, curling toward her, and the cold air pressed against her skin like an invisible hand. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. And then, from the far corner of the room, a soft creak broke the stillness. Like the sound of a footstep on the wooden floor. The soft creak echoed through the cabin, faint but unmistakable. Maria's breath hitched as her eyes darted to the far corner of the room. The flickering firelight barely reached the shadows there, and for a moment, Everything was still. But then the shadows shifted, just slightly, as though something within them had moved. Her heart raced as she backed toward the center of the room, her gaze fixed on the corner. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The silence that followed was deafening, the air around her growing colder with each passing second. Another creak, louder this time, came from behind her. Maria spun around, her eyes scanning the dimly lit space. The front door was still ajar, the chair she'd used as a barricade now pushed even farther away. The notebook on the floor fluttered open again, its pages flipping as though caught in a breeze that she couldn't feel. The whispers returned, threading through the silence like a sinister melody. "It's already here. It's waiting for you." Maria's hands trembled as she reached for the notebook, her fingers brushing against the rough leather cover. The symbols on the pages glowed faintly now, their jagged lines pulsing with an otherworldly energy. She turned to the next page, her stomach churning as she read the words scrawled in bold, uneven handwriting. Junior Michael proffered help with the rest of the writing for a moment. Then she said, "The door won't save you, nothing will." Her breath quickened, and she slammed the notebook shut, clutching it tightly against her chest. The shadows in the corners seemed to writhe, twisting and curling toward her like living things. The cold air pressed against her skin, and the metallic scent she'd noticed earlier grew stronger, almost suffocating. The pounding on the door resumed, loud and insistent, shaking the walls of the cabin. Maria's pulse thundered in her ears as she stumbled toward the door, her hands fumbling with the chair she'd used as a barricade. "Leave me alone!" she screamed, her voice cracking with fear. The pounding stopped abruptly, replaced by a faint, rhythmic tapping that sent chills racing down her spine. It wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from inside the cabin. Maria turned slowly, her eyes scanning the room. The shadows near the fireplace twisted violently, and for a brief moment she saw something emerge. A figure tall and thin, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the flickering light. It stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it were being pulled by invisible strings. Her legs felt like lead as she stumbled backward, her back hitting the wall. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a chaotic symphony that filled the room. "You let it in. It's part of you now." The figure moved closer, its skeletal frame casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. Maria's breath came in shallow gasps as she clutched the notebook tightly, the glow from its pages casting faint light on the figure's hollow face. It stopped a few feet away, its head tilting unnaturally to one side as though studying her. "Stay back," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a long, bony hand, pointing toward the front door. "What are you doing?" Maria asked. Maria hesitated, her eyes darting between the figure and the door. The whispers softened, forming a single chilling command. We let her go, spurring her forward to find the invitation. "Go through it." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." The figure's hollow eyes glowed brighter, and the shadows in the room surged forward, curling around her legs and pulling her toward the door. The notebook in her hands vibrated violently, its glow intensifying until it burned against her skin. The whispers became a deafening roar, their words blending into a chaotic chant. "What?" "It's the only way. You have to go." The front door creaked open wider, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The wind outside howled, carrying with it faint, disjointed whispers that sent shivers racing down Maria's spine. The shadows pulled her closer, and the figure stepped aside, its hollow gaze fixed on her, as though waiting for her to comply. Maria's chest tightened as she stood on the threshold, the darkness beyond the door seeming to pulse and writhe like a living thing. She looked back at the figure, its skeletal frame looming in the flickering light, and then at the notebook in her hands. The symbols on its pages seemed to shift, forming a single word: choose. The word choose glowed faintly on the notebook's pages, the letters shifting and writhing like they were alive. Maria's breath came in shallow gasps as she stood frozen on the threshold of the front door. The darkness beyond pulsed with an unnatural energy, its depths impenetrable to the eye. Behind her, the shadows twisted and writhed, creeping closer with every passing second. "I won't go," she whispered, clutching the notebook tightly. Her voice trembled, but there was a hint of defiance in her words. The figure with hollow eyes didn't move. It stood silently near the fireplace, its skeletal frame casting long, jagged shadows across the room. The whispers returned, louder now, threading through the oppressive silence like a chorus of unseen voices. "If you stay, it stays with you." Maria's knees buckled and she stumbled backward, her heel catching on the edge of the rug. She landed hard on the floor, the notebook slipping from her grasp and skidding a few feet away. The shadows surged forward, their tendrils curling around her ankles like icy chains. She kicked and struggled, but the more she fought, the tighter their grip became. "Let me go!" she screamed, her voice breaking. The shadows didn't relent. They pulled her closer to the door, their strength overwhelming. The cold seeped into her bones, and the metallic tang in the air grew stronger, filling her nostrils until it was all she could taste. The figure near the fireplace tilted its head, its hollow eyes glowing brighter. The whispers softened, forming a single, chilling command. "You belong to us now." Maria's mind raced as panic took over. She glanced at the notebook, its faint glow barely illuminating the floor where it lay. She reached for it desperately, her fingers brushing against the rough leather cover. The symbols on its pages pulsed with renewed intensity, and the shadows around her recoiled slightly, their grip loosening. The figure stepped closer, its skeletal hand extending toward her. Maria's heart thundered in her chest as she scrambled to her feet, clutching the notebook like a lifeline. The whispers returned, sharper now, slicing through the air like blades. "Choose, stay or go." She turned toward the door, her breath hitching as she stared into the void beyond. The darkness seemed to pulse, beckoning her with an almost magnetic pull. Her body trembled, and tears streamed down her face as the weight of the decision bore down on her. If she stayed, she would be trapped with whatever had entered the cabin, but if she went through the door, she didn't know where it would lead, or if she would survive. "Boy." The figure didn't answer. It simply stepped aside, its hollow gaze fixed on her as though it were waiting for her to act. The shadows shifted restlessly, their tendrils curling and uncurling as if eager to drag her through the door. Maria gripped the notebook tighter, her knuckles white. The symbols on its pages began to shift again, forming new words. Male step, and it ends. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a chaotic cacophony that filled the room. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around her legs and pulling her toward the door. The figure raised its skeletal hand, pointing toward the darkness beyond, and the whispers became a single deafening word. Now, Maria's chest tightened as she took a shaky step toward the door. The shadows around her loosened slightly, as though encouraging her to move forward. The air grew colder, the metallic scent so strong now that it made her gag. She paused at the threshold, her heart pounding in her ears. The darkness beyond the door seemed to ripple, its surface shifting like liquid. She turned her head, glancing back at the figure and the cabin one last time. "Is this what you want?" she asked, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It simply stared, its hollow eyes unblinking. Claire said. The shadows pushed her forward, their icy grip tightening around her ankles. Maria closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and stepped into the void. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, the whispers stopped, the cabin disappeared, and the oppressive cold vanished, replaced by an overwhelming silence. As it lasted, Maria opened her eyes, but all she saw was darkness, endless, suffocating darkness. And then, from somewhere in the void, a soft, chilling whisper reached her ears. "You chose. It's too late." The darkness pressed in on Maria from all sides, a suffocating void that swallowed sound, light, and even her sense of time. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stumbled forward, her arms outstretched, searching for anything solid to anchor herself. But there was nothing. Just the cold, empty abyss. The whispers were gone now, leaving behind an oppressive silence that made her ears ring. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound unnaturally loud in the void. "Where am I?" she murmured, her voice barely audible in the endless black. "What is this place?" Her question hung in the air, unanswered, until a faint light appeared in the distance. It was small and flickering, like a dying candle flame, but it was enough to draw her forward. She moved cautiously, each step hesitant, as though the ground beneath her might vanish at any moment. As she approached the light, shapes began to materialize in the darkness, indistinct and shifting, like shadows cast by an unseen flame. They seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her heartbeat, growing clearer with each step. When she finally reached the light, it flared suddenly, illuminating her surroundings. She was standing in a room. Not the cabin, but something older, darker. The walls were made of rough stone, their surfaces etched with the same jagged symbols that had adorned the notebook. A single wooden table sat in the center of the room, and on it rested the notebook, its cover now glowing faintly. It was empty now. Finally, Persephone sat down on the table. Maria's breath caught in her throat as she approached the table. The symbols on the notebook's cover pulsed in time with her heartbeat, and the air around it felt heavy, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. Slowly, she reached out and opened the book. The pages were no longer filled with scrawled words and crude drawings. Instead, they contained a single message, repeated over and over in bold, jagged handwriting to wash the slate clean of bad thoughts. "You brought it here. You are the key." Maria's stomach churned as she stared at the words. "What does that mean?" she whispered. "The key to what?" said Maria. As if in answer, the symbols on the walls began to glow, their light casting eerie shadows that danced across the stone. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and a low, guttural sound echoed through the room. It was a sound she had heard before, the growl from inside the cabin. She spun around, her eyes searching the room for the source of the noise. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, forming shapes that were almost human. They stepped forward, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You shouldn't have come," a voice whispered, echoing through the room. It was soft and disjointed, as though coming from multiple sources at once. "You brought it back." "Yes," the nurse interrupted. "Brought what back?" Maria demanded, her voice trembling. She clutched the notebook tightly, her knuckles white. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "What do you want for any of this?" The shadows didn't answer. They moved closer, their forms growing clearer with each step. Maria's breath quickened as she realized they weren't entirely human. Their limbs were too long, their movements too jerky, like puppets controlled by invisible strings. The guttural growl returned, louder now, reverberating through the room. The ground beneath her feet cracked, and she stumbled, barely managing to keep her balance. The shadows stopped, their hollow eyes fixed on her. "You opened the door," the voice said, louder this time. "You let it out." Maria's mind raced as the symbols on the walls glowed brighter, their light growing almost blinding. The growl turned into a roar, and the cracks in the ground widened, revealing a dark void beneath her. She clutched the notebook tighter, her fingers trembling. "What door?" she whispered. "What did I let out?" The shadows didn't respond. They simply stepped aside, their movements slow and deliberate, revealing something behind them. A tall, jagged door made of blackened wood, its surface etched with glowing symbols. The void beneath her feet pulsed, sending waves of cold air spiraling upward. The voice returned, softer now, but no less chilling. "You are the key, you must seal it again." Maria's chest tightened as she stared at the door. The symbols on its surface shifted, forming words that she could barely read. One must stay to lock it. One must take its place. Her hands shook as she turned to the shadows. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't. I won't." The shadows didn't move. The growl subsided, replaced by a suffocating silence. The door pulsed, its surface glowing brighter, and Maria realized with a sinking feeling that the choice was hers alone. Maria stood frozen, the jagged door before her pulsing with an unnatural energy, the words etched into its surface. "Burn. One must stay to lock it. One must take its place." Burned themselves into her mind. The shadows around her were motionless now, their hollow eyes fixed on her as though waiting for her decision. The notebook in her hands vibrated slightly, its symbols glowing faintly. Her pulse quickened, and a cold sweat broke out on her forehead. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't want any of this." The growl returned, low and menacing, reverberating through the room. The ground beneath her feet cracked further, the void widening to reveal an endless abyss. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, their light casting jagged shadows across the stone. Another burst of energy, almost all of it focused on the unbearable iron curtain. The growl returned, louder. "You are the key," the disjointed voice echoed, soft but firm. "It cannot be undone." Maria's hands trembled as she clutched the notebook tighter, the weight of the decision pressing down on her like a physical force. She glanced at the door, its glowing surface rippling like water, and then at the shadows surrounding her. Their silent, unmoving forms only heightened her fear. "I can't," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I can't stay here." The growl turned into a deafening roar, the void beneath her swirling violently. The door pulsed again, its energy growing stronger, pulling at her like a magnetic force. The notebook fell from her hands, landing with a dull thud on the stone floor. Its pages fluttered open, revealing a single word scrawled in jagged handwriting. "Decide." Maria's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The roar subsided, replaced by the whispers, now soft and mournful. "Yes, though these archives get clumsy at times, it is like a magician walking the tightrope," she said. Her mind raced as the gravity of the choice became clear. To lock the door, someone had to remain behind, bound to the shadows and the void. If she left, the door would stay open, unleashing whatever horrors lay beyond it into the world. The shadows moved closer, their hollow eyes unblinking. One of them extended a skeletal hand toward her, its gesture almost gentle. "You brought it here," the voice said, softer now. "You must finish it." Maria's chest tightened as she rose to her feet, her body trembling. She stared at the door, the glowing symbols shifting one final time, to form a single sentence. Seal it or let it consume everything. With tears streaming down her face, she stepped toward the door. Her hand hovered over its surface, the cold energy seeping into her skin. "If I do this," she whispered, her voice breaking, "will it end?" The shadows didn't respond. The door pulsed, its energy pulling her closer. With a deep breath, Maria placed her hand on the symbols. The roar returned, the ground shaking violently as the door began to close. The clock on the wall opened, and she flung herself through the opening. As the final crack of light disappeared, Maria's last thought was a faint hope that she had made the right choice. The cabin was silent once more, the door sealed, and the shadows gone. But in the void, a faint whisper lingered. "Another will come."